Well, hello and welcome to week 6 of Polity at Lancaster Theological Seminary. You're half done, and we are just about halfway through the Book of Confessions. We are right in the middle of considering the Westminster Standards, the first of which is the Confession of Faith, which we talked about last week, and then the two documents we'll consider this week, the Larger Catechism and the Shorter Catechism. The history of these is that in 1643, when they were working on the Westminster Confession, they were also the group doing that, the Divines, the Westminster Divines, they were called, were also asked to produce a directory for catechizing. There was a draft. The first produced was what eventually became the Larger Catechism. The Scottish delegates, who are actually the ones who ended up adopting this wholesale and really transporting it mainly to the United States, did not like it, so they continued to work on it for several more years, and then eventually they gave up having one and split it into two. The goal for the shorter was for it to be easier to read and concise for beginners, and the Larger Catechism was to be more exact and comprehensive. The Shorter Catechism was actually adopted first in 1647, then the larger in 1648, and then that year by the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, with some modifications made to the section on civil magistrates. So you can see even from the beginning there was a history of taking this particular confession and adapting it to speak more particularly in that time and space. Came in the late 1700s to America, the Presbyterian Synod of New York and Philadelphia individually, and then by the Presbyterian Church when it was formed. It continued, as we've said, long history of these catechisms being used, particularly the Shorter Catechism. And then what happened is, of course, we've talked about the Northern and Southern churches splitting, or the Presbyterian Church splitting in the Civil War into a Northern and Southern Presbyterian Church. In the late 50s, there was a merger of two northern branches into the United Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, and they decided they would rewrite the Westminster Confession. It was too much of a burden. We'll talk more about the adoption of the Confession of 1967, but in the midst of that, they dropped Westminster, including both of these catechisms, and but they came back in 1983 upon the merger into the church that we are a part of now. A little bit more about the Shorter Catechism. Main goal was to educate children and others in their language of a weaker capacity. That's according to the preface written by the Church of Scotland. It was based on the Larger Catechism, so that's the first one, and then brought down. The Catechism is a question and answer format, which had been popularized by Martin Luther as a way to help children learn the meaning of the material rather than simply memorizing the Lord's Prayer, Ten Commandments, and the Apostles' Creed. Shorter Catechism has 107 questions and answers. 12 concern God as creator, then 13 through 20 deal with sin and humanity's fallen nature. Questions 21 through 38 concern Christ the Redeemer, benefits that flow from redemption, and then 39 through 84, 10 Commandments, 85 through 97, sacraments, and then 98 through 107 explain the Lord's Prayer. And so you'll see that Lord's Prayer, Ten Commandments, and then as a whole the Apostles' Creed are contained in the teaching of this catechism. The most famous question, which really historically is known to a great many Presbyterian children, and so if you're in a Presbyterian congregation and ask particularly older members, what's the chief end of humanity, or what's the chief end of man, many of them will be able to respond that humanity's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Just reminder that the Shorter was meant for children and the uneducated. It is the most loved and well used of all the catechisms of the Reformation. The Larger Catechism, it has been said, was not loved, used, or influential. It just never caught on. It's not for preaching in the way that the Continental Confessions are. If you look at the Heidelberg Catechism, you will see that it is broken up by Sunday, and you can go through that catechism week by week, and was meant that we would preach it, usually in an evening service, to a congregation as a way of teaching them. The Larger Catechism is not designed like that. It's meant really for fuller instruction in faith. 196 questions, so more questions. The same breakdown in terms of Creator, sin, work of Christ, law and Ten Commandments, and then salvation, word, sacraments, and then prayer. But longer, and each of the answers for the most part is longer. I would say it is helpful for more information and theological conversation, and particularly if you're delving into a subject to get a more full look at what's going on. Both the catechisms have proof text, and so have the ability for us to look at scripture related to them. They're all different. Each is unique. I think a way to think about the catechism says the larger is meant for the church, the shorter is meant for the individual, which might be why the shorter is more popular. Just a couple of polity notes with it. I think from these catechisms we get our focus on purpose. Reformed theology and polity has a teleological emphasis. And so by that I mean the first question is, what's the chief end of humanity? What's the purpose of humanity? And if you look at the way that our polity is structured, it starts out with the purposes of the church and the mission of the church and what God is doing in and through the church. I think that comes through the emphasis of the way that these catechisms are written. The catechisms emphasize Jesus Christ as prophet, priest, and king. That's the trifold office of Jesus that comes out of Calvin's work. And from that, I think we get an emphasis on the pastor as a preacher, a caregiver, and a leader, which I think you see in our polity, those responsibilities for the minister of word and sacrament or a teaching elder. And I also think that in terms of our polity, out of the catechisms, you can see an emphasis in our polity on instruction, understanding, and explanation. We don't tend just to tell people what to do, but we try to explain why we are structuring things the way that we are. I hope that helps in terms of understanding these catechisms, their relationship to the polity of the church. There is also a study catechism that was written in the 1990s that was received by a General Assembly. It was never adopted and put into the Book of Order because there wasn't sufficient will in the church, and it wasn't really asked for to do that. But there has been a recent attempt to revive the idea that we would do catechetical instruction with people who are seeking to enter and understand the faith.